Confirmation hearings continuing for Trump's cabinet picks. Education Secretary nominee Betsy DeVos drawing a whole lot of heat for steering money away from public schools, as well as her controversial record in her home state of Michigan. DeVos has led the charge to expand charter schools, but that hasn't necessarily improved outcomes. In fact, federal data shows the state's charter schools actually scored worse than the public schools in several key criteria. She's also facing tough questioning about her massive political donations.
My question is, and I don't mean to be rude, but do you think if you were not a multi-billionaire, if your family has not made hundreds of millions of dollars of contributions to the Republican Party, that you would be sitting here today?
Senator, as a matter of fact, I do think that there would be that possibility.
Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, good friend of the program from the state of Connecticut, he asked the Education Secretary nominee about her position when it comes to guns in schools.
One final question. Do you think that guns have any place in or around schools?
I think that's best left to locales and states to decide. If the underlying question is...
you can't say definitively today that guns shouldn't be in schools?
Well, I will refer back to Senator Enzi and the school that he was talking about in Wapiti, Wyoming. I think probably there, I would imagine that there's probably a gun in the school to protect from potential grizzlies.
She did say that. Health Secretary nominee Tom Price, he's also facing a Senate committee today. Georgia Congressman, he's also facing tough questions about stock trades he made in the run-up here for several healthcare companies that profited him. He was shaping health policy at the time in Washington. That reportedly includes buying shares of a medical device maker just days before introducing legislation that would help that very company. New York Senator Chuck Schumer, none too happy about it. Here's what the Democratic Senate leader had to say about the issue.
This is not some broad legislation, cut all Medicare and affect some large company like Johnson & Johnson. This is a very narrow, specific company that dealt with implants, hip and knee, and the legislation specifically affects implants. He puts it in a week after he buys the stock. That cries out for an investigation.
At the hearing today, Price maintained he did nothing wrong.
Do you believe it is appropriate for a senior member of Congress actively involved in policymaking in the health sector to repeatedly personally invest in a drug company that could benefit from those actions? Yes or no?
Well, that's not what happened.
Well, let me just say that I believe it's inappropriate and we need answers to this.
Then we get to Scott Pruitt, and that is Trump's pick to lead the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's mission. That is to protect the environment. But Pruitt's record as Oklahoma Attorney General, it makes him a very curious choice if that's the ambition of the department. The state is a leader in fracking and oil production, and Pruitt, he's been a staunch defender of both, even when those industries have been ecologically damaging. He's also sued the very agency he would run more than a dozen times, mainly over regulations intended to, yes, protect the environment. At his confirmation hearing today, Pruitt, he made the biggest splash by his apparent flexible position when it came to climate change.
One such issue where civil discourse is absent involves climate change. Let me say to you, science tells us that the climate is changing, and then human activity in some manner impacts that change. The ability to measure with precision the degree and extent of that impact and what to do about it are subject to continuing debate and dialogue, and well, it should be.
All right, let's bring in a couple people to help me make sense of what we heard today. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and Richard Brodsky, former Democratic New York State Assemblyman, senior fellow at DEMO, and a professor at NYU. Okay, the education nominee has said, among other things here, that as it relates to public schools and their future here, that the public school system in the United States is a quote-unquote dead end, okay? You look at the Detroit experiment that she did, taking monies out of the public school system in Detroit and applying them to charter schools and also with the voucher programs. We can have good and fair debate about alternatives to public schools, some with various levels of success. But what was clear if you watched the hearing, beyond the fact that she didn't really seemingly get any prepped on, was that A, she's taking money out of the public schools to help the charter schools, but the charter schools didn't do any better than the public schools. But yet she wants to hold standards for public schools, but she doesn't want to hold the same standards for the charter schools. It's a very curious thing if you have the head of the education department who believes that there's no future in public schools in America. And I know the teachers union and all the biggest folks who have the most to lose out of this are going nuts by this. But that could actually be the new policy of the land. You listen to her today and you say, clearly this is why they brought her on. She has a different idea and a way to go about it, but there's no new money, theoretically, that closes the gap.
Well, guess what, Richard? You are being very polite in how you describe the situation. It's outrageous. It's devastating for public education, for those of us most of us that are educated in a public education setting. And it's outrageous. We've been down this road before, but it happened in New York City. I believe her name was Kathy Black, wealthy woman, not much education credentials. Bloomberg says, I'm going to make her my education chancellor, my education person. She lasted for approximately a year. It was a totally disaster. Deja vu. That's exactly what's happening now. We are looking at a situation of a wealthy woman who's being pushed because she supports charter schools, but has no experience for the most part in education. And to your other point of, think about this. Watch the tape of her hearings. Think about this, Richard. She was asked repeatedly, as you pointed out in your lead, should there be the same accountability? We can have a legitimate argument about charter schools and whether should there be the same accountability for charter schools as public schools? I don't know. No answer. What? So we're going to have two competing systems, but not by the same rules? That's not fair. That's not the American way.
I pivot to the EPA head, okay? Now, you can have debates in this country as to maybe regulations or onerous or whatever else. But it's beyond cynical when you have someone who wants to have the very department that he will now head, to have it eliminated, Richard. And that's what he repeatedly said.
Nothing new here. It happened under Reagan, James Watt. There's a pattern of Republicans taking right-wing ideologues and putting them in charge. That being said, there are two levels here. Their past actions and past beliefs are relevant but not dispositive. If this person comes up, raises his or her hand and says, I'll enforce the law that's given to me, then they're good enough to serve. The bigger problem is what policy message it sends to the people of the United States. You don't really need EPA. You don't really need a Department of Education. You're not so sure what you want to do with the Department of Health and Human Services. Those are the responsibility of the president. Some of the questions that were asked, for example, of what's her name, the DeVos, the education guy, were a little bizarre. I mean, the question of guns in schools, it's not her decision to make. The question of whether there should be standards for both, as Dominic pointed out, is right on point.
But leadership does come from the national agencies in that if people, for example, one of the questions...
There was an election.
There was an election, but the idea that gun-free zones should be going forward still applied, and the head of the department that theoretically not just would make policy but also enforce is saying, leave it up to the local folks.
That's where gun-free zones are enacted. They're done locally. They're not done by the feds, number one. Number two, I disagree with her.
Okay, but HHS. Clearly, we've already seen the beginnings of this, which is repeal. We don't know what we're going to replace it with. We're going to repeal the thing. To be fair to Price, he's the first and only guy that I've seen that actually had a plan. Now, I think the plan's crazy. I don't think the plan adds up, but he at least has a plan that he's laying out here. But before we can get to anything, do we agree, and Barrister, you can speak up here too, if you make stock trades on a specific buy, that you are personally shepherding the legislation through, and again,
it's a crime as you describe it.
How do we not have the right as American citizens, Republican or Democrat, not to have the basic minimums of the facts, to have a full investigation before you do a confirmation?
That's the Senate's fault. He disputes that those were the facts. I don't know. and he's entitled to a fair hearing. But if the
By
facts
the way,
prove out that way,
he
you're
did.
right.
If you listen to the balance of it, Dominic, he said he didn't deny it happened. He didn't even deny the timeline. He said that basically his stocks were being bought for him by a third party, and he had, basically no voice or fact in the matter. To say it's coincidental is to be charitable. But my point is, we're pushing people through, and specifically Republican leadership, pushing people through before we've done complete due diligence. If it turns out that, in fact, what is being alleged against him is accurate, then it's not in Republicans' best interest either to have this, because then criminal charges can be brought.
Explain it.
I can't, in that there's such a rush to do things, and we've become so highly partisan in this country that we excuse things that I believe a decade or two ago we wouldn't have excused.
How about maybe, I'm going to take the opposite side of my great colleague here, Mr. Brodsky. How about we wouldn't have tolerated these things less than a year ago? How about we wouldn't have tolerated these things 6 months ago?
And you know what? I think he's right.
It's almost wicked what the president-elect is doing. He is throwing so many questionable nominees up front at the American people. We could cherry pick and we could focus on each and every one in terms of a controversy. And one, maybe they'll make it through, but a case could be made for each one why they should not have the job, Richard. And he better be thankful that is the new HHC guy. The Democrats are threatening to slow this all down with Schumer, saying that Trump may not have this by the time he takes office. All I can say is the HHC guy better be thankful that Preet Bharara is not the U.S. attorney overseeing his situation, because he'd be looking at a criminal indictment right now.
And he will be the leading voice in Washington in terms of reshaping at least the Republicans' replacement for the ACA. All right, coming up next, President Obama gave his final news conference today, but he did take some final swipes at the Donald on the way out the door. We'll explain after this.